What's up, guys? Long time no speak, huh? Oh, by the way, this hat has a lot of meaning to it. And you'll see why during this episode of Jalen's Jumpstart. Um, yeah, it flips. This week's guest is going to be none other than Derek Forrest of DC News Now. 2 decades in the business, Derek Forrest has covered the MLB All Star Game, NFL Draft, NBA All Star Game, the Final Four, high school state championship, and just so much more. This dude also does a lot on the side. But I'm not going to spoil too much for you. Just tune in and enjoy the show and see what he has to say about sports media and how he got to where he was now as a sports director. He'll have a lot of good stuff to say. So tune in. So Derek, obviously growing up in New York, you've been in the community that's really journalism focused. A lot of people want to go there for journalism jobs. So did you always know that you wanted to be a journalist growing up, or was there another path you ever had in mind?
There was 100% another path that I had in mind. Growing up, I fell in love with the game of baseball when I was a young kid, and I started playing baseball at the age of 3. Um,
Oh.
so that was my thing. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, I was immediately a Mets fan. I always said that I jumped on the bandwagon in terms of my teams that I rooted for. I grew up a Mets fan who won the World Series in '86. I was 5. The Giants won the Super Bowl in '86. I was 5. Yeah. And then the Rangers won the Stanley Cup in '94. I was 13. And that was about the age that I probably started to really understand hockey and like all that stuff. But yeah, I was a big baseball guy. Grew up on baseball. My dad was a baseball fan. Started playing when I was 3. Played all the way through college, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to at least, you know, play professionally, play minor league ball, and see what happens. But what happened was I ended up going to a prep school in New Hampshire. So I left home when I was 13. I went to New Hampshire, played 4 sports there. I played football, baseball, soccer, and hockey.
Whoa.
Um, yeah, got a scholarship to play baseball at Stonehill College, just outside of Boston. Um, Played my freshman year a little bit. Shoulder started bothering me, like the summer leading up to my freshman year, and then into my freshman year. Went to a doctor, found out I was born with a bad shoulder, and just years of playing, I kind of grew into the injury. Basically, there's 2 bones in my shoulder, and everyone's shoulder when you're born, um, they're apart and they fuse together as you get older. Mine
Yeah.
never did. So when I throw overhand, which is not a natural motion, the bones release from each other, and as they release, one of the bones hits a nerve. So I get a dead arm feeling in my arm
Mhm.
if I throw hard. So at the time, I mean, I was playing outfield, I was playing center field or left field, and really any position in baseball. There's a time where you're going to have to throw at 100%. Basically, the dead arm. It was nothing that I could make the arm worse, at least according to the doctor, as long as I could play through the injury. But if you get a dead arm, you can't really feel your arm for 15 minutes in baseball. That's not really
Yeah.
the most feasible thing to do. So I ended up stopped playing baseball my freshman year of college. Um, at the time, I was a computer science major. Off air, we just mentioned my whole like gaming setup, but I had an interest in getting into graphic design and developing video games and all that stuff. And then I got hurt, and I decided that I want to stay around the game of baseball. One of my friends in college convinced me to do sports radio. So I did a sports talk show, and then I started doing play by play for football and basketball. And fell in love with it, and I said, "Hey, why not try TV?" Stonehill wasn't really big on a TV program or anything like that, so I switched my major to communication, and the rest is kind of history in terms of that. So, got my first TV job right out of college, and it's now been 21 years for me doing television.
So you mentioned you moved to Louisville, and I know within the 20 years you've been covering sports, you've been all over the place. I believe you lived in Ohio as well. And but while you were in Louisville, I know you also mentioned how the most valuable story that you've covered or your favorite was about the late great Muhammad Ali. So what was that? I mean, so what about that story really touched you the most, or what was his what do you think his legacy really had on the sport, not just the boxing, but just professional sports altogether?
Yeah, I think that's what was so impactful about that weekend. So I spent 3 years in Louisville, um, working there for the local CBS station.
Mhm.
Um, and then I took another job in Cincinnati. So I was actually in Cincinnati when he passed away. But Cincinnati being so close to Louisville when it happened, and my background of Louisville and the area and all that stuff, they sent me back to Louisville to cover that story. Um, so I think just seeing the way the town responded, I mean, it was pretty obvious that that was going to happen whenever he died, right? But to see everybody lining up on the streets, whether it was during the procession or beforehand or anything like that, to kind of share stories and all of that stuff. Getting to hear different stories. I met so many different people who had all of these stories about Muhammad Ali, about, they were just be outside, on the street, and he would walk by and like just stop and have a conversation with them. Or so many people who had just like a random picture of him of this one meeting that they had with the guy. Um, One of the things that really stood out from that weekend was I was over at the Muhammad Ali Center, which is in Louisville, and that's where they were really doing a lot of the memorials for him and dropping off flowers and all that stuff. And throughout the week, I got to see um, it grow in terms of how many people were paying respects. But I was there one day and I ran into a kid, and he had to have been maybe 9 or 10 years old.
Mhm.
Um, And I ended up stopping and talking to him. And he's like, yeah, I wrote this letter to Muhammad Ali, like telling him how much he's meant to me in my life and whatever. And he read me the letter, and he read me the letter on air. But it was in that moment where I was like, I'm 42, right? And I never saw Muhammad Ali fight in person. Like I grew up with Tyson and Evander Holyfield and all
Yeah.
those guys. This kid's 10. I mean, I wasn't 42 at the time, but this kid was 10 at the time. And I'm like, he's never seen him fight in person. Like, what does he know about Muhammad
Yeah.
Ali, right? So to see that impact of like the legacy that he had for this 10-year-old kid, and obviously it probably came from his parents, but for this 10-year-old kid to feel this way that he did about Muhammad Ali said so much about what Ali just meant to everybody that he'd been around, and how much his legacy will just always forever grow and continue to move on down the generations. And that
Mhm.
was like super emotional for me, uh just to see that impact. The other story that was interesting, and it's, I'm not to say it's self-serving, but it made me a little emotional. I went into Muhammad Ali's childhood home, because I was getting permission to talk to his family. um I ended up interviewing his brother Rahman Ali. But anyways, I walk into his house, and mind you, I said I was in Cincinnati at the time working there. I walk in, never met any of the Ali family before. Rahman looks at me and he goes, Derek, I haven't seen you on TV in a while. And I was like, what?
What?
And immediately just like started crying because uh, it meant that if Rahman knew who I was, that Muhammad also probably knew who I was. You know what I mean? And that was a little impactful too. Um, but very emotional, up and down, to hear everybody's stories about Ali, but to also see the other side of it, of people mourning him, and how big and how quickly the city stopped for all of that. And then it ended up going full circle because in the procession at the time was a young, probably teenage, uh Biagio Ali Walsh, who is a UFC fighter, his grandson. I ended up getting to interview Biagio Ali Walsh about 4 or 5 months ago, um, because he was fighting for the Professional Fighters League (PFL). Every Thanksgiving they do $1 million fight, and he was part of that. And being able to talk to him and reminisce about that weekend as well. So, but yeah, that was easily the biggest thing that I've covered, just in terms of the impact, the emotion behind it, all of that stuff. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's I didn't it's very cool how a legacy can be that generational because you go to that story with the 10-year-old kid who wrote the letter to Ali, you would think that that kid never even met Ali or let alone watched him on TV. And
Mm.
so it's just to have a name that big when people hear the name Ali, it's just like your children, your grandchildren, they're all gonna remember who Ali was. Um, Now, Derek, I want to talk about other positions that you've had prior to getting up to the sports director position and what that was like transitioning from college and then throughout those 21 years that you've been covering sports.
Um, the best way I would describe it, I was always a grinder. Um, I don't, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily the most talented person ever, or the most talented person on television, but um, I work my butt off to get where I am today, and I think that's the one thing that I would say about just the path that I've taken. Um, my first job out of college was ESPN. I was lucky enough to work there. I worked in production at ESPN for 4 years. Part of that was I had a high school teacher who used to be an executive producer. Her name is Gara, and she used to be an executive producer at ESPN. I reached out to her and asked her if there were any job opportunities or interviews that she could get me, and she got me an interview. Um, so I ended up getting the job at ESPN, and I worked 4 years there. And I knew from the beginning I wanted to be on TV and wanted to use it as a stepping stone to get in the door. And I just I got into ESPN, and I just worked my butt off to, continue to grind, continue to put myself in good situations. Um, I don't know how much you know about the ESPN. I was in the ESPN PA program, which uh, is pretty grueling. It's 7 months of trying to land a full time. You're working full time, but to land a position at ESPN, it's basically like the 7 month trial period that they give you to earn the right to continue to be there. And
Okay.
and so I got through that 7 month trial period and stayed on. Was I worked on shows like Sports Center and Baseball Tonight, and ran prompter for people like Stuart Scott, Scott Van Pelt,
So
Neil
nice,
Everett,
nice. Yeah.
Stan Verrett, like all those guys that you see on there now. It was a little bit of everything. The PA program. But I really took that experience to heart in terms of what I do now. That production experience, because I use a lot of that today now in terms of editing and shooting and editing montages. I'll do montages or show opens and things like that. So I used a lot of that experience. But my last 2 years, I worked on a show called Cold Pizza. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cold Pizza before, but it is now First Take. Cold Pizza was hosted by Jay Crawford, and Dana Jacobson. Also on the show was Skip Bayless, Woody Page, Kit Hoover was on there as well, and a model by the name of Vita Guetta. You probably know her now, possibly, but she was doing like
Mhm.
traffic for that show. Anyways, during that show, there was a segment called First and 10, which was a debate segment between Skip Bayless and Woody Page. And this was the first evolution of the debate segments that we now see, which you see on First Take and Skip Bayless's show, and Shannon Sharp was doing
What
that
you
for a little bit.
Bayless.
Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so I was on that show for 2 years, and Jay Crawford um, had started his career in Hazard, Kentucky, and there was an opening in Hazard, Kentucky. So I went up to Jay and I said, "Hey, there's an opening in Hazard. Like, is there any way you can give me that interview?" He was able to give me the interview, and I ended up getting the job there. But I worked my butt off. There were moments where, at some point, I was working almost every day for a full year. Um, just grinding content and all that stuff. And I spent 7 years in my starter market in Hazard, Kentucky. Um, and there was a moment where I almost quit the business. Um, because no one spends 7 years in their starter market in television. Like, I shouldn't say no one, but that's very rare that someone spends 7 years in a starter market, small town. Um, I thought I was terrible because I wasn't getting a job or I wasn't getting job offers. Um, about my fourth year in, I walked into my news director's office and I said, "Hey, clearly this TV thing isn't working. Um, I think I'm going to quit the business." And he convinced me to stick around a little bit longer. I stuck around 3 more years. And then after that, the jump started happening really quickly. After 7 years, I worked 2 years in Louisville. Then I worked 2 years in Cincinnati. Then I worked 4 years in Cleveland. And now here I'm in DC. You know what I mean? It happened super quick after that. But those 7 years, it was frustrating. But also funny looking back at my tapes because I still have some of those. Um, I probably needed the 7 years to grow. Um, so I always think one of my biggest strengths has been my patience.
Mhm.
Um, and being to kind of, I know it's kind of cliche saying it now, but to be able to trust the process and to continuing to get reps and figuring out like a lot of things a lot of people don't think about when it's television is like finding my cadence and my pitch and my tone, and like all of that stuff goes on top of also being able to report and going out and shooting and going out and editing. Like, there's so much to it. Finding my voice, all that stuff, making sure it sounds like I'm reading on television, but making sure it doesn't sound like I'm reading and that I'm talking. Like, so I've always kind of really grinded out like a all my skills coming through all the different stations. And my goal every time I'm at a different station is to be as versatile as possible, is to know as much stuff at each station as possible. Because I think the more you know in the industry, even outside of your just whatever's in your lane, it just makes you a little bit more valuable. And that's kind of the route that I've always taken. And then for me, the talent has then followed. But I've never really focused on the talent aspect. And when I say that is like, I never super 100% just focused on the on-air presence. It was more about focusing on everything else, but then continuing to get reps, and the on-air presence also followed.
Okay. Um, Question about whenever you told your manager about where you were throughout those 7 years, what was that conversation really like, if you don't mind me asking? Because do you feel like you maybe, had you said something earlier, maybe you would have seen the progress or just gone other places sooner?
No, because I don't think the conversation isn't what helped my growth. I don't think. Um, But without that conversation, I probably would have just quit the business. You know what I mean? I don't think I would have gotten the opportunity for him to convince me to stay. Like if I just walked in and said, "I'm not signing a contract, I'm done." You know what I mean? But it's funny because um, we still have a relationship to this day and we joke about it, but there were definitely moments in our relationship where we butted heads a little bit. I remember being in his office once and him telling me, and he was probably right at the time, I will say that, but he told me, truthfully, looked me in the eye and he was like, I don't think you could ever anchor in a top 50 market. Like that's just not in your future. And at the time, it was probably true. Because when I go back and I look at my stuff, I'm like, yeah, I probably wasn't ready to be in that top 50 market. Um, but it also probably lit a fire under my butt to get to that point, to be able to be in a top 50 market. And it's ironic because my first job after I left Hazard was Louisville, which happened to be a top 50 market, and I was an anchor. So we always go back to that where I'm like, hey, remember when you told me I couldn't anchor in a top 50 market? Well, here I am in Louisville. Oh, here
There
I
you
am in
are. Yeah.
Cincinnati. Oh, here I am in Cleveland. Oh, by the way, I'm in DC now, which is the top 10 market. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I don't know. I don't think like I said, I don't think the conversation really had anything to do with my growth. Maybe it did spark a fire under me, but again, I was always going to work my butt off no matter what. And I'm still like to this day, I'm always constantly pushing myself in all aspects of life. And I've always been that way. Whether it's fitness or nutrition or TV or like whatever, I'm always constantly thinking, what can I do better? How can I improve? That's always kind of been who I am.
Yep, and here you are at DC News now. I do want to. I I was watching some of your segments, gaming with Derek, that you
Uh,
do with and all of your other coworkers. Can you tell me a little bit about more about that? Is that just more for entertainment, or is it sports related? I know I actually saw the I saw the Star Wars segment, and I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. We should probably I might try to do something like this one day. But I mean, what is it? What is it about? I mean, tell me about it.
so first of all, don't steal my idea. Number one, number one. But no, 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 no. So gaming with Derek kind of has evolved. So it started, and we mentioned this in before we really hopped on. So when I was in Cleveland, I was at a point where I was like, what can I do that's a little different that nobody else really does,
Mhm.
but also stays true to who I am? And I was like, thought about it for a while. And then I was like, I know what it is. I was like, gaming. I was like, I play video games. Like, that's my thing. I'm not a hardcore gamer. I used to be when I was younger, but I was like, gaming's my thing. And I was like, what should I do with gaming? So then it hit me that I should play video games with athletes. And I was like, let's do that. So the initial process for me in Cleveland was I'm a PlayStation 5 guy. So I was like, okay, I've got a PlayStation 5. But at the time, crossplay is a little bit more popular now where you can play if someone has an Xbox, they can play on PlayStation and Nintendo, vice versa. But it still wasn't huge then at the time. So I was like, okay, I have a PlayStation 5, but when I got there, Baker Mayfield got drafted right by the Browns. So I'm going to use him as an example. So if I have a PlayStation 5 and I'm like, hey Baker, like let's do this gaming segment, and he goes, I have an Xbox. Well, I can't do it, right? So I went out and I got an Xbox. And then I went out and I got a PC. So I have PlayStation, Xbox, PC. I've got all of them because
Mhm.
I didn't want that to be the limiting factor of getting a guest. So then it
Okay.
was about booking guests, and I started booking people that I had known. When I was in Cincinnati, Josh Harrison, who plays, I'm not sure where he's at right now, but he plays Major League Baseball. He was with the Pirates for a while, shortstop. He used to do a baseball camp every year in Cincy that I had covered. So he was like one of the first people I reached out to. Hey, like, I've got this idea. Like, would you help me with it? And he's like, yeah, sure. So I played like MLB The Show with Josh Harrison, right?
Okay.
Um, and basically the concept was we would stream it live on our social medias. So in Cleveland, we would stream it live on our Facebook page. That would give viewers a chance to ask questions through the chat. And then I could then ask Josh. But it was very lighthearted. I'm not asking super serious questions. We're talking some trash, very lighthearted stuff. I might find stuff on social media that like I could ask him about and talk to him about and like all that stuff. And I've got OBS here at home, so I can like pull up different screens and monitors and show things. So I'm not just like talking about something I can actually show, all that stuff. Um, and then I would edit like a 4 or 5 minute clip for television. And that's basically how it started. And that slowly started to build in Cleveland. I got guys like Robert Flores on MLB Network. I played NBA 2K with Darius Garland and got my butt kicked by like 50 plus. Jordan Phillips, who's a linebacker for the Browns, hopped on. Nolan Jones, who was one of the in Guardians top prospects who's now in Colorado. You get the point.
Yep.
So I started doing that. But if I got someone who was like, I'm interested in doing it, because what happened was we then hit COVID in 2020, but I wanted to continue the series. So I started doing, let's say, each week when the Browns played a team, I would call up a sports reporter at the local market. So if the Browns were playing New York, I called up WPIX, who at the time was our sister station, and I got Justin Walters, who's now working for ESPN. And I would say, hey, I want to do this preview segment on the Browns, blah, blah, blah. But if you're a gamer, we could also play video games. And he's like, oh, that's a good idea. But what if I don't play video games, but I still want to do it? And I was like, great. If you don't play video games, I can do trivia with you. So we can go back and forth and I can do trivia, or like we can do something different that's not video games to still continue on with that gaming with Derek. Um, so gaming with Derek here in DC, that's a long story to say. Gaming with Derek in DC, from what you see it, is that trivia aspect that I would do with people who weren't gamers, but still wanted to do something fun. It's also something I did with CrossFit and a bunch of CrossFit athletes, because I actually worked media for CrossFit as well. So it was a way, but it was a way to get everybody involved. You know, if I called you and you were like, "I'm not a gamer, but I really like the segment," I was like, "Perfect, we can just do trivia and like still mix in some interesting things." So that's where gaming with Derek, from what you see at the end of our show every night, that's where that part of it comes from.
Okay. That's pretty unique, man. I love watching those with you and Alex, and then you say like, "Oh, correct, incorrect," and it's
Yeah,
fun to watch.
yeah. It's funny because one of my friends also called me out, because it also gives me, it's a slight chance for people to see my actual personality. And I'm a little bit of a smartass, and it gives me a chance to kind of be a smartass, like mediating everything as well. But I think it works out. And it's a good way to end the show after we give you, a good 25 minutes of solid like sports content, that we end with something fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I had another question about CrossFit. You covered CrossFit, but were you also a CrossFit athlete as well?
No, I am far from an elite CrossFit athlete. I mean, I do CrossFit, right? I've been
You
doing
do.
CrossFit.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been doing CrossFit for the past 7 years, but I'm nowhere near the elite status that you see, like people who are at the CrossFit Games and all of that stuff. But yeah, I've been covering CrossFit for the last 3 years, which has been super cool. And that's kind of been, that route was kind of the same as my TV route, where I kind of just took a chance and I slid into someone's DMs who works for CrossFit Media and said, "Hey, like, I'd love to work for you guys at some point." And I ended up getting a job, and that's been a super cool experience. That's taken me really cool places too.
Wow. That's incredible. Sometimes all it takes is just reaching out. That's how I got my
Yep.
job at Channel 4. And then the rest
Yeah.
is like didn't even have to go through an application or anything. So it's
Yeah.
always good
Yeah. Yeah.
connections.
Honestly, I tell people all the time, especially people who want to get into the business, like, that's, I like to see people with initiative, right? Um, I can tell someone to do something all day long,
Yeah.
but that person needs to actually do it. So what I always tell people, like the easiest thing, especially if you're interested in TV or whatever you're interested in, is to just DM somebody, email somebody, and just say, "Hey, like, I'm interested in getting into this field. Like, can I shadow
That
you
easy.
for a day?"
It's that easy.
Because I think in any job, right, you have a perception of what people do, but you don't actually know until you see it. So if you just go shadow someone for a day, it'll kind of, you probably need more than a day, but it kind of gives you this idea of, okay, this is what I want to do. This is, or this isn't what I do. I've had people who've shadowed me, and at the end of it, they're like, this isn't what I thought. I'm not interested. And that's good though, that you got that experience, as opposed to like getting a job and getting somewhere and going, I hate doing this. So that's always been my one biggest advice, because the worst thing someone's going to say is, no, you can't shadow me. But you know what? That's okay. Like, that's not rejection. You just go on and move to the next person.
Yeah, yeah. It's you always need a visual. I've had to shadow a few people, and I mean I do that at work now too.
Mm.
But it gives them it lets them almost act like they're actually working, but not really. You're just giving them a visual of, oh yeah, this is what I do every day. This is what you have to do, uh, and it comes with a lot of sacrifices.
Yep.
Last thing, before you head out, for your in honor of your love of baseball, and whenever we met, I kept this thing here. This is for the, oops, I don't know if you can see it, but the
I,
gnat. I think it flips. I'm not entirely sure, but I just wanted to come on here and have that hang out there for you. So I
so
appreciate you so much,
yeah,
Derek.
no problem. Side story on the hat real quick. Yeah, that's the reversible bucket hat for the Nats. That's also right now Alex's lucky hat for gaming with Derek. He apparently is undefeated when he wears it. So that's now his thing. Is anytime he goes up against somebody, he wears that hat for his lucky hat now for gaming.
Which side? Either side or
Either side, either side.
wow. Yeah. Wow, that's insane. Yeah, I saw you guys doing that segment and I was like, wait a minute, I met him. I met him when I was covering the Commanders with JP back in January. And he's a fun guy.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. But thank you so much, Derek, for joining me today.